The recent tag synergy and champion changes in DC Dark Legion have caused a massive meta shift. In today's video, we're going to be breaking down my latest tier list, and I realize that you probably see Lobo there in my roster. Don't worry, we're going to have a new Whaler skip very soon, probably within the next week or so. So stay tuned for that. And if you want to see a little bit of a sneak peek of where I think Lobo is going to land in my next tier list in March, definitely stay tuned to the end of this video and we'll talk about that for just a few seconds. For now, let's jump straight into the tier list because we got a lot of ground to cover. Now we're going to mix things up a little bit, and I'm going to go through and talk about these changes based on the class of the champion rather than going from left to right on each tier level. So we're going to start with the DPS champions first. And I do want to just briefly say, you know, we are entering into this true spiritual renaissance, I think, in the game. Spiritual damage is king or queen, however you want to look at it. And champions like Constantine and Sinestro, they're kind of the 1A and 1B win condition champions that are out there in the PvP meta right now, in Meta Brawl 3v3. You really want to have those champions on your team, and they're the ones who are doing the heavy lifting. So they are going to remain in S tier, but we did have to drop down our Nightwing to A+ tier. I'm sorry, I had to do it. I know there's a lot of people out there who have invested into Nightwing, non-spenders, new players who know that they want to go after him. And what I would say is I still recommend that you go after Nightwing and build an account around him. It's perfectly fine. I just think that, you know, if for people who want to know what the true current PvP meta is, it's not Nightwing. But he's going to provide, his team is going to provide you a decent amount of wins in ship combat game modes, and he really just still works in everything. So, you know, I've said this a million times before, A+ tier champions are 100% recommended to invest into. It's just, you need to know what you're getting, and you need to make sure that you have a plan in place for where you're going to use that champion, what you're going to be doing with them. So they did have to drop Nightwing down because I just think it makes sense in the current meta. I think he does kind of fit that same mold as a champion like Deathstroke, where you know, they, depending on how you use them, they can be really, really good. And on that same vein, we did have to drop Robin down a peg as well because I just don't think it makes a lot of sense to move Nightwing down and not talk about Robin. Robin is a champion that I've always considered to be kind of Nightwing light, and a champion that you would go after and try to build up while you're waiting to pull for Nightwing. And I think that's probably changed a little bit. You got to be careful with investing too much into Robin. He really has tapered off a lot in the last few months. So, you know, if you're in a fairly new server, just be mindful of the fact that, you know, within like 8 months to a year of that server being open, Robin is going to become less useful than he is at the early stages. And you may want to consider going with a champion like Red Hood that you're going to be getting a ton of shards for as a legendary that you can kind of ascend to mythic over time, or even just kind of use as a stopgap until you get to Nightwing. So a lot to think about there, but did have to move Robin down into B tier. I still think he is more usable than certain other champions. Obviously, having those stats as a mythic champion puts him above a lot of legendaries, but just be mindful of some of the limitations. And Talia does see a move upward. It was a lot easier to justify that with moving Robin down, but also I just think Talia and Raish probably should be kind of even keel here. I'm curious to see how their kits are going to be reworked. It does sound like the developers are in the middle of doing a rework for both of the Al Ghuls as well as Hawkgirl. We're not going to get to Hawkgirl in this discussion today, but I just do think that Talia, I've heard some reports that she is, there's some sort of a bug going on with her kit right now, and she's not performing as intended. But for the most part, I think, you know, prior to this last update, she definitely performs at the A tier level if you invest into those assassin champions. So we're going to leave her at A tier, and we're going to monitor and see what the developers cook up whenever they change those kits. I don't really see that happening until probably the second quarter of the year, so probably somewhere between March and June, but more to come on that. The next champion is a new one for the tier list, and one that is near and dear to me because I have been heavily focusing on my Amazon's champions, and that's Artemis. Artemis is I think, an A+ tier champion. She doesn't quite rise to that level of S tier where she's the win condition for your team. I do think that people are going to be able to build some reasonable Amazon's teams around Artemis, but the true use case for her and the reason why I think that she is A+ tier, well, there's two reasons. Number one, the less important version is she can pop tires on Killer Tank, and she actually ends up being pretty decent in combat cycle. But the most important reason is, especially if you have Mistress equipped, she's going to be able to, when she ults, if she wins her duel, she's going to give a massive amount of attack to the rest of the team. And so if you have a Death Metal Wonder Woman win condition team out there, she's going to give a massive amount of support to that team. So she's not going to be the star of the show, but she's definitely going to be there providing a decent amount of support. And I mean, she just deletes Deathstroke and some of the other assassin champions that are going to try to go after her very early on. Definitely has a weak spot with a champion like Sinestro or Constantine, probably even like Supergirl. But, for the most part, she is just, been a truck for me in PvP. Next, we have to talk about Supergirl, and unfortunately, I did have to move her down from S tier to A+ tier. The meta is just not allowing for her to perform the way she was performing probably, around the time she came out until, a few months ago. With all of these shield champions coming into the game and with the rise of the spiritual damage meta, it's just very difficult to keep her where she is. I do think that Supergirl has a place in the meta, but Superman family really needs a fifth. They need like a lifter champion. And one of the things that I talked about in my top 8 teams video, and I'll be putting more of those out in the future. That's definitely going to be a monthly staple on the channel now, so stay tuned for that in a few weeks. But Supergirl really forms the basis for your Superman family faction now, rather than Superman, and we'll talk about him in a moment. But Supergirl requires, it's not an optional thing. She requires both Crypto and Superboy. So it's definitely not a cheap setup to be able to do what you need to do to ramp her damage up, because you can't just have Crypto at low stars. He has to be at fairly high stars for his kit to do his thing with ramping that Krypton energy. And then obviously Superboy just needs to do 2 or 3 ultimates in rapid succession at the beginning of a fight. So, for those reasons, I feel like Supergirl needs to drop down just a little bit. She just doesn't ramp well in PvP and Meta Brawl. With the shield meta, there's probably some sort of a lineup that you could run. Maybe you take Superman completely out and try to run Hippo and Swamp Thing, something like that, where you're just providing yourself some time to ramp up and get your Supergirl going. But let me know in the comments below if you've tried anything like that and you've had success with Supergirl in the current meta. Unfortunately, Superman did have to drop down a tier again. I just don't see him being on the same plane of existence as Supergirl in terms of damage, and so I had to drop him down. He does offer a different niche for what you're trying to do with like building a hyper carry lineup, and he offers a decent amount of strength at the very beginning of a server's lifespan. So if you are just starting out on a server, definitely you want to go for Superman and try to build your account around him early. But you can actually get away with like a blue star or purple star Superman to start out with, and wait until something else shows up that you can use. I've talked about that in videos before, but you can build like a true Justice League team around Superman, and he can carry you through the early stages of Training Simulator. So still a great champion, but just definitely not meeting the expectations that we have of these S tier champions that are coming out in the bleed recently. Scarecrow is another champion that I really don't want to have to talk about again in a video. He's gotten more updates to his kit than any other champion in the game at this point, and unfortunately, based on some long-term testing since his faction tag and changes and his kit changes came out, I just don't think that he's performing anywhere near S tier or A plus tier. I never put him into S tier. You probably could have made that argument for it, but he was definitely at the top of A plus tier previously. With these new kit changes that they've done, they take away his ability to withstand the spiritual damage meta. He actually was probably one of the few ways of combating the spiritual damage meta, and could do a decent amount of spiritual damage himself. Now he's really just a way to curtail the physical damage meta, and we really don't need that because physical damage is definitely not superior to spiritual. Biggest thing they did was made it difficult for him to stun. He can no longer instant stun unless you invest a massive amount into his unique legacy piece. And again, for all those reasons, had to drop Scarecrow down into A tier. Still recommend that people go for him if you're building a very specific team. I think he goes really well in like a hybrid setup between Arkham's Most Wanted and Legion of Doom. I've spoken about that before on the channel. But you can definitely bridge that gap and have kind of two teams that you can swap back and forth between. So you can build up Joker for your combat cycle, and then you build up Legion of Doom for PvP. But that's enough about Scarecrow for now. Next champion that saw some movement is Bane, and Bane was one of those Arkham's Most Wanted champions I recently featured in a discussion video a couple of days ago, where he saw some changes to his kit. And the big thing that they did was they just fixed what they call a bug, where he was stunning or incapacitating champions on his ultimate, and that would result in you being able to pop tires on Killer Tank. It was also a pretty decent way to stop damage for a few seconds in PvP. Not being able to utilize that mechanic, or I guess apparently bug, definitely drops him down a little bit. He's not going to be quite as strong as he was before. I do think that in a niche setup where you're trying to build Arkham's Most Wanted, and you used all your anvils to pull for Joker, and you're either waiting to pull for Scarecrow, and you couldn't afford enough anvils to get him to a reasonable level, or if you just know that you're not going to pull for Scarecrow and you need a tank for Arkham's Most Wanted, Bane is going to fit that niche for you. So he definitely still has a spot somewhere. It's just not in the top meta team. I really hate to keep having this discussion about Batman, but he is dropping down to C tier, even more niche than before, especially with all of these new Bleed Limited champions that are coming out. He just really has no place at all, and I think it's a waste of money to spend money on the packs to try to get him. Obviously, if you can get shards of Batman for free without pulling him in the bleed, or random mythic shards or mother box pulls or whatever, that's fine. But I personally would not recommend that you use Batman for pretty much any team that you're going after. If you have Red Robin, you already have a tank for your Bat family, no need to use Batman. There's so many better Justice League champions than Batman that you can use, especially on the front lines. So unfortunately, until they actually fix this kit, as opposed to what they did whenever they changed this kit previously, he's just going to suffer in the depths of despair at this point in C tier. And I really hope that they make a complete 180 on Batman and make his kit relevant again. I've spoken about this with people privately, but my favorite, I guess, anecdote for a champion like Batman is Star Wars Galaxy of Heroes, another game that I cover content for, where basically they give you Darth Vader for free whenever you start playing. and you can earn shards of him and you can build him up, and it's kind of like the idea is that you can build a team around that to get you started. And they made some changes to his kit because he was so horrible to start out with. They made him a crazy good champion, and then they had to nerf him down. But, it's just about finding some balance and making those iconic characters worth using in a team. And unfortunately, Batman, it just isn't usable at all, even though he should be a win condition champion. Like, he should be an early win condition Bat Family champion, but he's not. Moving over to the support champions, I want to start with Starfire. Starfire is a champion that I would say all of our healer champions, I've struggled to kind of like get them into a hierarchy and figure out kind of like what the pecking order is. But I think it's pretty obvious at this point that Starfire has the better stat scaling, and she just has the better healing kit for the most part. I do think that, Green Lantern, we'll talk about him in a moment, that he's still a great champion, but, his uses in the meta just aren't quite there right now. We've kind of hit this wall where we're at, pretty much if a champion doesn't have a shield and they're a support, they better be ramping the damage of the team, because those are kind of the only two reasons to be using a support champion in a lineup. And Starfire's stat scaling, like I said, her healing is basically a shield, and so she is getting used by pretty much any whale lineup that you look at. We talked about that in the top 8 teams video that I recently made, but just looking at meta reports and seeing where she's being used and what teams are finding success, I think Starfire has to be the top healer in the game, so we popped her into S tier. And the other champion that moved into S tier is going to be the Riddler. This is a champion that is fairly new, so not too many people have him. We do have some global launch players who've got their hands on Riddler now, and we're seeing him appear in many of the top meta teams as well. Again, those shields are incredibly helpful, and quite different from Starfire's kit. He's going to be able to put a bunch of debuffs on the enemy team. It does take a little while to ramp that up, so it's not like the most important part of the Riddler's kit, but those shields are incredible. And if you have the Conundrum Cane, he actually can do a pretty decent amount of healing, so he kind of negates the need for a champion like Poison Ivy in your Arkham's Most Wanted team at all. And even for a lot of the other teams that you're going to be running him in, again, he just has a lot of things in his arsenal to keep your team alive and make it easier for you to beat the enemy. I think in a lot of ways he functions the same way as Swamp Thing, where Swamp Thing can do a massive amount of damage reduction, and any way that you can slow down the enemy team or make it easier for your team to do damage against them, those are things that you want to do. I've always been big on turn meter manipulation in these types of games, speed, for example, and putting debuffs on teams that make them do less damage is in some way a turn meter manipulation, because they're not going to be able to do as much damage, and you can ramp your ultimates a little bit faster. Superboy did have to drop down a tier to A+ tier. I do try to keep some balance to the tier list and make sure that we don't have too many champions up in S tier. At some point you have to make decisions on bringing people down the ranks. I don't like adding new tiers to try to fit people places. I think it makes a lot more sense that over time, when you're playing these games, that you keep the same tier rankings and you just suppress people down as they aren't as effective as they were previously. And with the fall of Superman Family, makes it a little bit easier to justify moving Superboy down anyway. I do think that he and Crypto are still incredibly useful when you're running them with Supergirl. The nice thing about both of these champions, though, and I know I didn't move Crypto, but he's down in A+ tier for a reason. The nice thing about these two champions is they don't require Supergirl to be useful. Supergirl requires both of them, but it's not the other way around. So you can actually use Superboy in Combat Cycle or Training Sim, like any mode, Realm of Fate, any mode where you can control ultimates and you can do things manually. Superboy is very useful because you can use 3 ultimates on one champion and then go to your second DPS, do 3 ultimates on that one down the line. These champions do require a lot of manual effort, in my opinion, though. Green Lantern, I talked about a little bit already, but he is dropping down to A+ tier. I think we just have to recognize that his stat scaling is not as good as that of Starfire. And I actually think, I've been talking with some other fellow content creators about this. They really need to consider making Green Lantern a Mythic Plus character so that his stats will scale a little bit better. I mean, if he's going to be a paywall champion like Nurse Harley, then, give him the stats to make it worthwhile to wail on him. Otherwise, he's going to continue to fall into obscurity as we see more Mythic Plus champions come out. Poison Ivy did not see any movement on the tier list this month, but we should probably talk about her for just a moment. Her kit has been completely revamped. She no longer has like much of a damage aspect anymore. I mean, she really didn't previously anyway. Long time ago, at the very beginning of this game's alpha beta stages, she did have a little bit more damage in her kit. She was like a true S tier champion, but they definitely gutted her kit. They're trying to make her more of a pure play healer. She's got more heal over time. She doesn't have that burst healing with the vines that she used to have. And it seems like we talked with or got some confirmation from the developers she wasn't supposed to lose super armor, but I think she might have. And even if she still has it on the vines, it's not enough. It's not nearly enough. I do think that she is still a pretty decent healer. Actually, I did a very small amount of testing whenever I was making my video to cover all the kit changes, and she seemed to be keeping the teams alive that I was running in Combat Cycle. So I'm curious to see a little bit more testing from her, but I don't think that she's going to be performing any better than Green Lantern or Starfire, so we're going to keep her in A tier. But we did drop Raven down to B tier, and the reasoning for that and the reason why she dropped instead of Poison Ivy is we're seeing a ton of resurgence of the Arkham's Most Wanted team with how good Joker performs, and looking at Nurse Harley and Riddler, champions like that. And so it just makes a lot more sense to keep Poison Ivy where she is if we're seeing a lot more Arkham's Most Wanted in the meta. But the real reason for dropping Raven down is champions like Riddler and Starfire that are getting used with like a hybrid Justice League Dark team. There's really no reason to keep Raven on the team if all she does is provide some healing, when you have these champions that can provide shields and they do other things. So like Swamp Thing, for example, can do a massive amount of damage reduction, and he's Justice League Dark as well. So you can run kind of like a hybrid Swamp Thing, Zatanna, Constantine with some other things. You could run Queen Hippolyta or Riddler for shields, and then you run Sinestro for some additional damage. And that is just, faring way better in PvP setups than having Raven in the lineup. And then last, or I should say second to last, because I want to hit on Lobo for just a moment as well, but we have Penguin. Penguin finally got an adjustment to his kit to make him actually usable at early stages of the game. You look at these B tier, C tier, D tier champions, and what I see is not champions that aren't usable, but champions that are much more helpful to non-spenders, light spenders, early game players, and they taper off, as you are able to obtain the higher end version of that champion. So it's kind of like a lower level brand, and then like a higher level high end brand is the way I would look at it. So like Penguin is just discount Joker, and his new kit, he's going to be able to put some burning on the target, and it stacks up to 100 times. You see that as a theme with all of the Arkham's Most Wanted champions now, and I really like the damage over time theme. I also think that, doing a little bit of early testing with Penguin, he definitely is going to be able to put out a decent amount of damage, but it's not nearly what Joker can do, or Nurse Harley for that matter. So putting him up, cautious optimism, I guess, that he might actually be viable for early game players. So I'm putting him into C tier as kind of a niche champion. He's no longer just objectively bad. He actually has some use now. So anyone who has invested heavily in Penguin, I commend you. And maybe now you'll get a little bit from that. Let me know in the comments if you have a fully developed Penguin that you've been using. I'm curious to see what you've been able to do with them. You know, I released a short video on Lobo a few days ago, just talking about my impressions of his kit and kind of how he's been working out for me very early on. I did pull him to yellow stars. I think that's, you know, a pretty decent place to get him to. You kind of have to get him to high stars. Unfortunately, you know, that's just kind of the way of things for some of these characters. I think he fits in that same niche as Ra's al Ghul, Talia al Ghul, where they can do a massive amount of damage, but the way that you have to build a team around them right now, because they don't have a ton of tag synergy, is you basically have to pull things from elsewhere. So I think it may have been Arkaluck, someone I was talking to about this champion that had them at a very high level made the comment recently that, you know, if you're trying to build for 3v3 and you have to tear your teams apart to make a champion work well, it just doesn't make a lot of sense. So might work for some very specific teams in Meta Brawl as like a second tier damage dealer. He does do a massive amount of damage, especially with those dolphins from after he casts his ultimate. I think that's on his third basic ability. But, you know, his revive mechanic does not work well at all. Basically what happens is he revives, and when he does, he doesn't drop aggro. So someone's just going to keep hitting him, and if he only heals for 10%, unless you're able to immediately get some HP on him, some like burst healing, it's just not going to be enough to keep him alive. So I want to see some more champions developed around the Suicide Squad lineup to see if Lobo can actually become viable down the road. I've heard rumblings that he can actually get a little bit of synergy with Nurse Harley. So again, he's certainly well food. There are going to be some lineups where we can actually get him to work out really well. I've seen him do really well on some of the combat cycle bosses too. So more to come on Lobo. Definitely going to be putting out a Will or Skip video, and we'll talk a little bit more about him there. And we'll also be ranking him in the Marks tier list. Well, that's all the time we have for this tier list video. I know these always run long, but I hope that I was able to provide you with some helpful information and some insight around some of these champions. As always, the full guide or infographic for this tier list is going to be posted in the Guru Guide section of the official Discord. It's also going to be posted on my Discord in the DC Dark Legion section. If you like this video, make sure you hit the like button, subscribe to the channel. You'll get notified anytime I come out with new DC Dark Legion content. And if not, I still hope to see you on the next video.